Sometimes when you ask for advice, you get way more than you bargained for. Heather Havrilesky, also known as Ask Polly, is here to talk about the book of her advice columns called How to Be a Person in the World.
Living in the moment and feeling the way things are, and also accepting the imperfections of the moment, these things are crucial to happiness, and they're crucial to happiness whether you're 25 or 55 or 75.
A novel about a 30-something woman trying to be an artist, hold down a job, and conceive a baby is also a pretty biting satire of celebrity do-gooders. Jessica Winter is here to talk about her first novel, Break in Case of Emergency.
They don't really know what they're doing. No one there knows what they're doing. They don't really have a sense of mission. Leora doesn't have a sense of mission.
Alexander Alter will be here to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. And John Williams and special guest star Jenny Schuessler will be here to talk about what we're reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Heather Havrilesky joins us now from LA. She is the author of How to Be a Person in the World, Ask Polly's Guide Through the Paradoxes of Modern Life. Heather, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Pamela. I'm thrilled to be here.
How did you get into the advice-giving business?
I sort of was doing it on my blog for many years when I was, my writing career was kind of nascent. Back in 2001, I needed a way to have some kind of structure for my blog so it wasn't just kind of a journal.
Mm-hmm.
And then Cheryl Strayed hit the internet with Dear Sugar. Of course, we didn't know it was Cheryl Strayed yet, and I would read those columns and just cry my eyes out every time. And I thought, I'm kind of writing this stuff, but I don't think that my stuff makes people cry at all. But I think she sort of showed how literary the genre can be and how emotionally moving it can be. And, you know, I was already an essayist. It suddenly struck me as like a natural kind of place to put my talents. At the time when I pitched the column to the All, I really just wanted a weekly deadline, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, what can I write that isn't fixed into the news cycle, that isn't, you know, about TV? I'd been a TV critic for years. And so I pitched it, and they said, sure, yes, existential advice sounds great. And then I just found that it was kind of a natural thing for me to write. And I love writing. It's my favorite writing that I do.
And how did you pick Polly as the name of your sort of alter ego?
Well, you know, it honestly didn't even strike me that I needed an alter ego. And Corey Siha at the All said, I think you've got to be Dear something, right? So I looked back on my career, and I actually had a pseudonym at suck.com when I was a writer for that website. It was one of the first websites back in 96. I wrote a cartoon for them, and my alter ego was Polly Esther. So it was kind of a natural fit to use that name again, and now I'm Polly.
You wrote a piece for New York Magazine's website recently just about how things are harder these days for young people, especially that the problems that you're seeing just seem incredibly grim. Did that come from the book, or was that kind of just a riff off of the book?
Yeah, that was not from the book. It was actually kind of a longer piece that I had been thinking about for a long time, having kind of fielded a lot of questions from millennials in particular. You know, I think that we have an assumption that millennials are sort of digital natives. They have no problem moving from device to device and showing their full selves online, and they don't see the problem with revealing all kinds of details. And I think what I see more and more in my letters is this sort of dissonance between having to present this curated self to the world,
right,
and also consuming other people's curated selves, and then the internally feeling guilty and embarrassed and ashamed of all of the natural human emotions and natural flaws that we all carry around with us. So that piece is really about maybe millennials aren't perfectly at peace in that very public realm, or at least as at peace as we think they are. And in fact, this curated self that they are kind of forced to show each other is creating a feeling or a sense that the basic human emotions are unacceptable things.
Right.
Anyone who's kind of dabbled in social media or has a presence online is familiar with the ways that these things can kind of injure you on a daily basis.
When you and I probably were teenagers, you would maybe catch someone passing a note that you weren't supposed to see, read someone else's note that was written for someone else about you, and how painful that would be to inadvertently come across that information. And what your essay showed was that that is the entire internet for teenagers today. It's for young people that it's like you're seeing that note that's passed around that you're not supposed to see.
There is that feeling that a lot of your most personal, intimate details are sort of susceptible, and you can kind of peer in on other people's most private things. But then on top of that, there's an impetus to polish and create this larger than life, better than life, best self that you show to the world too, that can be, you can spend hours, fine-tuning that image. And it's seductive for young people to fine-tune that image. I think it's seductive for anyone to fine-tune that image, honestly. If you apply your common sense to it, it's obvious why it's confusing, right? But what I think I see behind the scenes in the letters that I get is that these things cause a lot of misery and confusion in young people and in older people too. I mean, there's a sense that your career needs to launch immediately. Fame is just a click away, and you just have to manage stay on brand and manage the way that you are perceived. And you'd think that this was only the realm of people in media or actresses or people with artistic careers, but it actually kind of has invaded everyday life in a really strange and not very helpful way.
Yeah, I feel like people are still kind of grappling with that.
I don't think that we really understand how it's changing or the pressures that it's putting on people. But I think that it's an interesting area to observe and watch as it, evolves. And, I think that being aware, millennials get kind of a bad rap. There's a sense that they want instant success, instant fame, and they're not willing to work for it. But if you look at the messages that our culture gives them, it's a constant, steady flow of these instant fame stories. I mean,
right.
People are thrilled and attracted to that story specifically.
Do you get a lot of questions from readers that fall into a general category of like, everyone else is or everyone else seems to be, but I'm not?
Yeah. Part of that is just when you're in your 20s and 30s, it's easy to feel that way. People get good jobs, they get married, they suddenly start having kids, and, it's easy to feel left behind. It's kind of a combination of this is a common sensation for someone in their 20s and early 30s, and then the fact of living in this strange fishbowl and observing other people and feeling like, the people who are bragging about their lives are the people who've got a few things figured out. There's a sense of like getting left behind, and what I say to people over and over again is there's no timeline, and in fact, it took me years and years and years to figure out what I was doing with my life and how to have a lasting relationship and how to, even meet someone, how to hold out for someone who made sense to me, how to make good friendships that last. And I don't have everything figured out. I think that my arrested development has stood me in good stead along the way. I have a lot of compassion for the struggle to get your life in a place that you feel like it makes some sense. By the same token, I think I've also learned that even when everything is in place, you have to feel what you're going through. You have to find ways of feeling your emotions and also showing your emotions to other people openly and sort of coming out as an emotional being. That's a struggle for a lot of smart younger people and a lot of smart older people. I think it's a struggle for all of us because our culture doesn't make a lot of space for emotions. And I think that that's shifting, but I'd like to be a part of that shift because I think that it's a much healthier way of being. And, I personally wasn't happy until I could show how I felt. And also just privately being able to feel your own feelings is, people say, gratitude journaling helps. People say things like, I have this ritual or that ritual, I meditate, I do yoga. But there's a very simple connection that you make to living in the moment and feeling the way things are and also accepting the imperfections of the moment. These things are crucial to happiness, and they're crucial to happiness whether you're 25 or 55 or 75.
We all give each other advice all the time, and some of that advice is really bad advice. What makes advice good?
To me, good advice, it doesn't swing straight out of the gate as completely directive and prescriptive. I think that it can. It depends on the situation. Certainly someone who, in my book I have a guy who's saying, tell me one good reason why I shouldn't cheat on my wife.
Right.
Here are my justifications. And in that kind of case, yes, of course you're going to say, okay, cheating is about honesty. Don't cheat on your wife. Don't even believe that this is an acceptable path without talking to her about it, potentially. Generally speaking, making some space for where someone is and understanding and having compassion for where they are emotionally, and also putting yourself in their shoes and saying, my God, this must be really hard. And, understanding the source of someone's emotional dissonance, I think that's sort of the first step. I don't think there's a ton of advice in the world and given out by other people that is patient. The best advice is a patient kind of advice where you're listening half of the time. Sometimes people just, are going to repeat a pattern until someone listens to them. In some ways, they're just acting out because they need for someone else to acknowledge how dramatically bad the pattern that they're stuck in feels. And it's almost like when you don't have anyone listening to you about that, you push back by continuing to run on the same hamster wheel.
Do you, when you get a letter and you give your advice, do you then hear back sometimes from those original letter writers saying like, well, I took your advice, I did X, Y, and Z, and now this happened?
Yeah, I do. Luckily, I probably hear back mostly from the people who take the advice and use it, and it really works, and they feel good. Their lives have shifted. I got one letter from a woman who, she was like, how am I going to be single indefinitely? I don't know how to live and keep my life buoyant. And I said, get a dog. I think she said she liked animals. So she sent me 2 years later a picture of her dog and said, this really did make a difference.
Oh, that's great.
So that was great. I mean, I love hearing back from people. I don't hear back that often. It's like they're ashamed of coming back unless things have really changed dramatically. But I love it when I do hear things.
Do you ever feel like you've given advice and then later on you think, you know what, oh my God, that was just not good advice?
I think when I started the column, I felt that way a little bit more. But I also used to blunder in and be a little bit more bossy with people than I am now. I'm definitely assertive and opinionated. Mm-hmm. I think that I was bossy with myself when I started writing the column, actually, and I've evolved a little bit since I began writing the column. So now my advice, I look back on some of those early letters and I think it's not so much that I'm giving bad advice, it's just that the tone is a little bit over the top, bossy. And, there are people who you kind of want to take that tone or you won't shake them out of the place that they're in. But my favorite approach now is a little bit more patient than that. So I tend to look back on the older stuff and say, uh-oh, that's a little much, But I think that my approach has softened a little bit towards myself and towards my readers as well. So
you feel like your giving advice has almost been good advice for you in a way.
You don't really feel ethical in doing this stuff if you're not, prescribing all this different behavioral changes, if you're not applying them to your own life. And at some point, I actually kind of felt like, look, you're not even living in a way that makes you completely happy. You can't even say you feel happy, so how can you possibly tell other people how to be happy? So I had to actually kind of look at how I was living and change a lot of things and change the way that I perceived things even. And so that's been really helpful. I think that I learned so much in just having to kind of hold myself up as an example. On the other hand, I hold myself up as an example of someone who messes up a lot too, but I think that has its own kind of value. Some people just are never going to get their act together completely. It's kind of like in their blood, and I think I'm probably one of those people, and it's just the way I am, I'm never going to be the smooth professional who handles every situation without, a lot of noise in my head. And so I think accepting that is probably something that I kind of preach about a lot.
Well, I'm very tempted to have you help me get my act together right here now on the podcast, but I will content myself with reading about other people's problems and all of the solutions to those problems. Heather, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was so nice talking to you.
Heather Havrilesky is the author of How to Be a Person in the World, Ask Polly's Guide Through the Paradoxes of Modern Life. Alexandra Alter joins us now to talk a little bit about what's going on in the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So let's talk about what happened this week in the book world. It was a kind of big week.
Huge week, huge. It started on Sunday with the release of the Harry Potter play, which was highly anticipated for months, and tons of people pre-ordered it. So we found out just how many people bought it. It sold more than 2 million hardcover copies in the first 2 days on sale, which is pretty impressive, although by Harry Potter standards, not so impressive, given that book 7 sold more than 8 million copies in just 24 hours when it came out. Yes.
Well, we should mention that A, it's a play, and B, it's not by J.K. Rowling.
Yes. So in that way, it's extremely different from the first 7 books in the series. And it's interesting. It's kind of caused a minor schism in the Harry Potter fandom. You have one group of hardcore fans saying she gave it her blessing, she helped shape the plot and the story. It doesn't matter if she didn't write the words on the page, and it doesn't matter if she didn't come up with the idea. It's part of the canon. This is the next chapter in Harry's story. Then you have another very vocal group of unhappy fans saying if she didn't write it and she didn't come up with it, this is not a Harry Potter story, and I don't want her licensing out her characters to anyone else to continue it. This isn't Star Wars. She's an author. She's our favorite author.
She's not allowed to license out her own characters. Only readers can make that decision.
This is another interesting thing about Harry Potter fans. You have such devotion to the characters that it's probably I would imagine, the most common form of fan fiction on the internet. For years since the series ended, and it's been almost a decade, people have been writing and reading Harry Potter fan fiction. So they're very comfortable with reading other versions of Harry's, very strange versions of Harry's. One that I recently came across was Harry serving as an au pair to Draco Malfoy's son.
He didn't do that?
Not in the original book.
Not in the real Harry Potter world.
No, there's a ton of bizarre reimaginings of Harry Potter, and people love them. If you love Harry Potter, you just want to read more and more about the characters, and it doesn't matter who wrote it. So you would think, given that attitude, and I think a lot of fans have adopted that attitude, you're happy to read anything more, particularly even more so if she has authorized it and been involved in some fashion. So.
Okay, 2 questions. 1, when is the last time a play sold this well?
I think the answer is never.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
That's
certainly
kind of
if you're looking at the collected works of Shakespeare, those have sold more over time. But for a play to become an overnight bestseller and sell 2 million copies in 2 days is completely unprecedented.
Sometimes I wonder if it's not part of a grand plan J.K. Rowling has to completely revolutionize what kids read.
That would be just like her.
First time to get kids to run out and get a play to read.
I'm also really curious to see what the sales and fan response will be to Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, which is being published. It's a screenplay, of course. Mm-hmm. She wrote it this time, so unlike the play, these are her words. But it's being released after the movie comes out or the same weekend. So I think the point of the play being published in part was to let fans who can't go to the production still follow the story. With the screenplay, I think most of the fans are going to see the movie. So right. I'll be curious to see if as many people buy the screenplay.
Now, that is already based on a book that was part of the Hogwarts Library trilogy.
Exactly.
But are they going to create a novelization of the screenplay of that book?
That's a great question. I will
feel
find
like
out.
There's got to be some publishing plan in the works.
I'm sure there must be, or at least a coloring book.
All right, let's just talk about a few of the other books that have been making their mark this summer.
Yes, and this week has been an interesting one as well. We saw the Pocket Constitution rise to number 2 on Amazon this week. And another version, a short version of the Constitution, was in the top 10 as well. And that was following the remarks of Khizr Khan at the Democratic National Convention when he held up his Pocket Constitution and challenged Donald Trump to read the Constitution. So apparently a lot of people were inspired. He gave a great lesson in civics, and people are picking it up.
And on the other side of the publishing aisle, there are some books on the bestseller list.
Yes.
That bear a different political bent.
Exactly. On the nonfiction hardcover list this week for the New York Times, the number 1 book is Crisis of Character by Gary J. Byrne and Grant M. Schmidt. That is by a former Secret Service officer who claims to have witnessed scandalous behavior by the Clintons. And it's been on the list for 5 weeks now. So you can see there's obviously conservative books that are getting a lot of attention this summer. Number 2 is Hillary's America by Dinesh D'Souza. And he's a conservative author and pundit, and he is, again, warning readers against the dangers of a Hillary Clinton presidency. So
Do we have a third?
Well, yes. In fact, we have a third and a fourth. There is Wake Up America by Eric Bolling. This is a Fox News Channel personality who is talking about the key American virtues that he maintains are under attack by President Obama and Hillary Clinton. Then no nonfiction bestseller list would be complete without an appearance by Bill O'Reilly, of course. He's at number 7 with Legends and Lies, The Patriots. And these are stories of the American Revolution. It's a companion volume to his Fox News series.
No liberal books there.
Unless you count Hamilton, The Revolution by Lin-Manuel Miranda. I know that's history, but it's certainly a very multiracial, multicultural view of history. So maybe we could count that just for a little bit of balance.
Don't read.
Liberals must not read.
Okay.
Not nonfiction.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Jessica Winter joins us now. She is the features editor at Slate and the author of a novel, her first novel, Break in Case of Emergency. Jessica, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's hear about the genesis of this novel. You've been working as a journalist for years. Were you sort of also working on this novel on the side the whole time?
No, it didn't occur to me until a couple of years ago, which was about 15 years into my journalism career, that I wanted to try to write fiction. I think something that happens when you've been writing nonfiction and publishing for a really long time is these lovely people known as agents start approaching you and saying, hey, do you have any book ideas? And I never did. I was always so awful at coming up with book ideas. And something that I heard a lot was, when you come up with an idea for a book, you have to make sure that you are the audience for that book. You are the person who would want to purchase and buy and recommend this book because you're going to be spending so much time with it. And when I thought about it, the books that I love reading, the books you'll find me reading in my spare time, are always novels, almost invariably. So I think that's what planted the seed that maybe I should try writing one of these things that I love so much.
What is the last good novel that you read?
I read The Beautiful Bureaucrat by Helen Phillips. I just read that 2 days ago, actually. It actually has some affinities with my book that I didn't realize. I'm doing a reading soon with Helen, and that's why I wanted to read her work. But her book also takes place in a pretty hellish workplace, although it's hellish for very different reasons than mine. And it also deals with how fertility and the workplace can collide, although, again, in very different ways than mine.
All right, so tell us a little bit about what the book is about and your protagonist, Jen.
Jen is in her 30s. She's somewhere between 30 and 35. It's 2009, so she is kind of unemployed and
financial crisis.
Things are not financially great for her or for millions and millions of other people. And kind of out of desperation, she takes a job at a celebrity charitable foundation that is kind of a joke, but she tries as hard as she can, too hard, to make it work. And in the meantime, she has these aspirations to be an artist that she's kind of sort of abandoned, but not quite. She's torn between her two best friends who present to her two very different designs for how to live. One has a very traditional and quite privileged existence with a husband and family, and the other is kind of a traditional starving artist who has no interest in any of the who seems to have no interest in any of the conventional trappings of family and work and so forth. And she's also trying, and so far failing, to have a baby. So she has a lot going on.
So you decided, okay, I'm going to write the kind of book that I like to read, which is a novel. And what did you want to accomplish in the novel? What was the goal that you kind of set for yourself?
I don't know that I had a goal. I had two overlapping ideas that I wanted to explore. One of them was the ridiculous celebrity charitable foundation. That seemed like endlessly rich terrain.
Yes,
to me
not exploited enough, I think. So thank you.
That just seemed like it would be a lot of fun and had a lot of satirical possibility. And then the other was I wanted to explore having a body in a workplace that isn't necessarily sympathetic to people having bodies and minds and lives outside of the office. Jen's particular battle is with infertility and then later with early pregnancy. And
spoiler.
Sorry about that. I thought it had pretty universal application to anyone who had ever had health issues or just had issues that they had to deal with that were somewhat conspicuous in a workplace that praises authenticity and
Right.
openness over a sense of dignity and privacy. So those two things kind of mapped onto each other very readily. And that was my starting point, I guess.
And the irony, of course, is that this nonprofit organization is supposed to all be entirely about women's empowerment. And of course, it's kind of anything but that in terms of how they treat Jen.
Yes, the Leora Infinitus Foundation is kind of vaguely but passionately grounded in this idea of women and girls being empowered, which has become, quite its own industrial complex in recent years. They don't really know what they're doing. No one there knows what they're doing. They don't really have a sense of mission. Leora doesn't have a sense of mission and doesn't really empower, should we say, her employees to figure it out for her. Everyone's kind of afraid to say that out loud. And so they talk around it and they pretend like they know what they're doing. And everyone is managing up. And so for someone like Jen, who's kind of in the middle toward the bottom, she gets a lot of that management trickling down, and it's very, very difficult for her.
There's a great section in the book early on where you just replicate this back and forth of emails between Jen and her immediate supervisor that, yes, it reads as very funny and satirical, but totally and completely believable. I don't know, maybe you want to even read a few of these because I feel like everyone who's listening, who's ever worked in any kind of work environment will recognize just the ridiculous back and forth between the supervisor, Karina, and Jen when she first comes on board.
Sure. So Jen has just taken a job at this celebrity nonprofit that she knows it's ridiculous and it's just a stopgap to, pay her bills before something better can come along. So this is from Karina to Jen. The subject line is happiness, ! Dearest Jen, I'm so thrilled that you've accepted the position here at Lyft. I'm sure Leora is sorry that she couldn't make it for our chat, but I'm also sure she's just so amped to meet you. Promise me that on your first day, you'll let me take you out for a proper lunch, an old school, glamorous steak and wine lunch. We should celebrate. Indulge me, XO K. So Kay is going to be her direct supervisor, and Leora is the overlord of this whole organization. A couple of minutes later, Jen to Karina. Karina, I'd be thrilled to. I'm so excited to be joining Lyft. You've already extended such a warm welcome. Very grateful and looking forward to lunch. All my best, Jen. Fast forward to Jen's first day. Subject line is still happiness, ! From Jen to Karina. Good morning, Karina. I was having trouble getting buzzed in, so I sneaked in with a UPS guy. Hope that's okay. I've parked myself on a couch in reception. Do you happen to know where my desk is located? Or someone else who could help? Sorry to bother you with these mundane matters. And most important, are we still on for lunch today? Thanks, Jen. So
it's almost painful to hear this because it's so recognizable.
So that's about 9:15 a.m. This one comes in at 11:47. Jen to Karina. Hey, Karina. I knocked on your door earlier, but I think you were on a call. My wonderful new colleague Daisy found a cubicle for me and is helping me get on the grid. Let me know when you have time to chat today. Does lunch still work? Thanks, Jen. Then about 4 o'clock, same day. Hey, Karina, things are humming along here, but I will need your sign-off before I can log on to my computer and get set up with email. You might have noticed that John from Building IT has been calling you. His extension is 2523, and all he needs is a signature to get us going here. Thanks, Jen. Karina writes back just before 5. Belatedly welcome, Jen. So glad you're here. Been slammed all day and need to run. Tell John yes, it's fine, and send me days for lunch. And then there's a smiley-faced emoticon.
I love where it ends up, which is...
It goes on for quite a while.
Each email completely credible. She ends up saying that she's not really into lunch and would she like
Karina
to have coffee.
Is not a lunch person.
Right.
And so things devolve into coffee. And then they devolve further from there. Yeah.
This must have been pretty easy to write. Having worked in a few workplaces.
I mean, everyone's been in one of these email exchanges. Everyone's been in a reply all nightmare of one kind or another. I think this happens with friends, too, where you sometimes with a friend or an acquaintance, someone wants to make a show of wanting to hang out, but they don't really. And so the email exchange becomes one long aversion or diversion. But yeah, it was pretty easy to write. But that email exchange, so many people who've read the book have brought that up. Like that's the first thing they bring up because I think, it's a pretty universal experience, which makes it easy to write.
It's interesting because obviously there's a rich tradition of the workplace novel, but it does seem like there are a few things that are going on now that are, if not unprecedented, a little bit new. The influx of women in the workplace, the kind of fluidity of the workplace and the flexible workplace, and the ways in which technology have completely altered the workplace, a new generation of millennials in the workplace that we're seeing now in fiction. I mean, your book is, as you mentioned earlier, you mentioned Helen Phillips's book. Elizabeth Egan wrote a book last year that was a satire of an internet company. Why do you think, or what do you think is going on in these books? And did you think of your book as kind of being one of this recent wave of women in the workplace novels?
I didn't actually, because the book is openly, and I use the word proudly, derivative of two books by men, incidentally. One is Personal Days by Ed Park, and the other is The Ask by Sam Lipsyte. And there are explicit homages to both of those books in mine.
Do you know Sam and Ed?
I know Ed's a dear friend of mine. I've never met Sam. And if you're a fan of either of those books, you will get to sections in mine like, oh, this is just like The Ask, because I wanted to be really clear about where I was coming from, especially as a first-time novelist and as someone who had never written fiction before. I think I was looking for models of how to do it, and those were two of my models.
What did you like so much about each of those books?
I felt like in some ways they were sort of sweet and sour mirror images of each other. Ed's was the sweeter one. And
That's a sweet
Sam's
guy.
and Sam, who I'm sure is a very sweet guy too, was the sour one. No, I think most of it for me was that they did two ostensibly contradictory things at once. They rendered these very familiar to anyone who's had like a dumb white collar office job. They rendered these very familiar situations with the email exchanges and the passive aggressive conversations and the managing up and everything that we would recognize from those sorts of jobs. But they also tilted them just enough, and Funhouse mirrored them just enough to make them seem strange and trippy and weird. And Ed's book in particular just delights in language so much, and how office lingo can become its own weird language and bonding material too. I think it's the way colleagues get through the day together, just like coming up with these weird word games and jokes. I just loved how they did that. And those books came out, I think, in 2008, 2009. And so I think, if anything, I was like, oh, I'm so far behind them in doing what I'm trying to do. But yeah, there is this little vanguard. I mean, Camille Perry,
yes,
who wrote
Reviewed
the review.
Yes.
I haven't read The Assistants yet, but I remember reading the premise for that book and thinking, okay, this is solid gold. I have to read this.
Now you see the logic in that assignment.
Yes, absolutely.
So this is a question I always have to ask other people who have day jobs like you do. You're, as I mentioned earlier, the features editor at Slate, and have written a novel. How did you do it? Like, what was your regime? When did you write this thing?
At first, I wrote it in little drips and drabs. I would, have a random idea here or there, and I would send myself an email with a vignette or a quote or an idea for a character. And then once all of that started to cohere, I started writing in 5-hour blocks on weekends, and became a somewhat antisocial person who wouldn't make plans on weekends as much as I used to, because I was obsessed with writing this book. Another thing I can highly recommend is don't have children before you've written all your books.
They tend to interfere.
But get pregnant halfway through writing a book, because that will give you a logical deadline. Those two goals are kind of they're kind of in conflict with each other. But I got pregnant exactly midway through writing this book, and so I decided I had to finish it and try to sell it before the baby was born. And so that really put a fire under me.
So which came first, the book or the baby?
I sold the book 15 days before the baby was born.
Good for you. Double birthing.
And I'm working on my second book and my second baby right now. So I'm engaged in this same race to the finish. But I think I'm going to lose this time.
How many months pregnant are you?
4.
Uh-oh. And what page are you on?
No, it's a little harder with kids finding the time, because on weekends, that's the time. If you have a full-time job, that's the time that you have with them, and it's precious, and it's very difficult to say okay, here you go, kid. You're off with your grandparents and I'm going to write.
While I pursue my art.
Well, yeah. I love that novel, Department of Speculation by Jenny.
The Jenny Ophel,
Yeah, when she writes about being an art monster. I don't have it in me to be an art monster. Maybe an art goblin or something. An art elf.
What's the most fun thing about writing a novel as opposed to kind of what you do, the journalism that you do during the day hours?
The thing that relates the two that I love so much is the research. I mean, this book was pretty heavily researched. I interviewed a lot of people, some of whom are acknowledged, some of whom aren't, for their experiences, whether in the workplace, working for a nonprofit, with infertility. And I really love doing the research. My next book is very research intensive. It's a great way to procrastinate about writing because writing is hard and research is really fun and easy. But I think just the freedom of being able to make stuff up as a journalist, you have a sacred duty to get everything just right and not misrepresent anyone and triple check all your facts. And
they're like playing hooky all the time in a way.
Yeah. I mean, the book has to have an internal logic. It has to be, I mean, in a sense, I did fact check this book. I made, artist friends of mine make sure that Jen's painting technique seemed right. And, I could just make people walk around and do whatever I wanted them to do. And I'd never had that experience before, and it was kind of addictive.
You get to be the boss.
Yes.
All right. Jessica Winter, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela.
The book, again, is Break in Case of Emergency, and it's a debut novel by Jessica Winter. Joining me now are John Williams and longtime podcast listeners will remember Jenny Schuessler. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
We're going to talk about what we're reading. Let's talk with Voice from the Past, Jenny Schuessler first. What have you been reading?
Well, it's been a busy couple of weeks, and I've really only been reading books for work. And fortunately, they've been good books and interesting books, starting with the book everybody seems to be talking about this week, Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, or as Oprah said when she announced it for her pick, the Underground Railroad, probably so no one could confuse it with the Overground Railroad.
An important distinction.
Yes.
In this book.
Yes.
All right.
What did you think of it?
I loved it. I thought it was great. I'm a reporter. I'm supposed to be neutral, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's a really great book, really powerful, and I think it's fantastic. It will reach a larger readership thanks to Oprah.
Jenny, on this podcast, we're all about uninformed opinions, so
exactly.
Don't worry.
Okay, I'm good with that.
I'm reading that now, too, and I probably, too, should not have an opinion, but I'm enjoying it a lot so far.
Yeah.
And you're reading the other Underground book.
Oh, I also, by maybe not coincidence, but a couple of weeks before that, I had been reading Ben Winter's sort of alternative history thriller, Underground Airlines, also a kind of riff on the Underground Railroad. I had to stop in the middle because I knew I needed to start Colson's book, and I didn't want to kind of confuse my plots and my conceits.
And that's because you profile Colson Whitehead in the Times this week.
Yes, a story that ran today. It's online. I went and met with him last week, and he had known about the Oprah pick for 4 months. It had been, very tightly guarded secret. He told me he hadn't even told his mother. So
we all knew here. We just didn't say anything.
Well, we knew a couple weeks ago, I guess, keeping secrets. So I talked with him last week, and it was kind of the calm before the storm for him. Yeah, I think we're going to be seeing that guy around a lot more. He's going to be recognized on the subway. Speaking of Underground Railroads, who knows?
And you were on heavy book duty this week because you also reviewed a book.
Yes, I reviewed a book in the Daily. It was a sort of odd, really interesting, I think really good book called The Selfishness of Others, an essay on the fear of narcissism by Kristen Dombeck, who is the advice columnist or had been the advice columnist in the kind of hip Brooklyn Literary Journal N+1, which when I wrote the review, I was trying to think, what's the comparison? Is that like being the philosophy columnist for Car and Driver or something? I don't know.
John, what about you? What are you reading?
Before I get to that, I should correct the record. Last week during this segment, I mentioned the writer Janet Frame, and I recommended that readers go and look at her Times obituary, which is of great interest. But I called her Australian, and a reader and a fan of Frame's wrote in to correct me that she was in fact from New Zealand. So that was my mistake last week. In terms of what I've been reading this week, well, I finally finished Wuthering Heights, which I've talked about in the past on the show. So I understand the Kate Bush song now. And I do prefer Jane Eyre. so the country can sleep easier knowing my preference. I think Jane Eyre just has more going on in it, has more registers, and Wuthering Heights is sort of a burst of one particular tone for a while. But I'm glad I read it. And then I just started this week keeping Parl's spirit alive while she's out, because it was on her recommendation a few months ago. Shirley Jackson's novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which was her last novel and published in 1962. This is an edition that has, I almost never read an introduction before I start reading a book, but this one by Jonathan Lethem is really good. It's 5 or 6 pages, puts it in great context. I can't imagine reading it and not going on to read the book. And then I thought I would maybe share the first paragraph of the book because it's very striking.
Please do.
My name is Mary Catherine Blackwood. I am 18 years old and I live with my sister Constance. I have often thought that with any luck at all, I could have been born a werewolf because the 2 middle fingers on both my hands are the same length, but I have had to be content with what I had. I dislike washing myself and dogs and noise. I like my sister Constance and Richard Plantagenet and the Death Cup mushroom. Everyone else in my family is dead.
That's kind of a perfect paragraph.
It's kind of a creepy but perfect opening, so it pulled me in.
Sounds just like you.
It sounds just like me. That's exactly the way I think of the world.
But you're not a werewolf.
I am not. I've had to make do with what I had, as she says.
You're hiding your finger. You're hiding your hands under the table. Can we look at your middle fingers?
It's a very Trumpian moment.
Have you read The Haunting of Hill House as well? I
haven't, actually. I think the only thing I've read of hers is The Lottery, which, of course, I read in school like everyone else. The short story, the very creepy short story about the villagers who... Well, I won't spoil it in case there are 3 people left who went to school who haven't read that story.
There's been a real Shirley Jackson kind of extended moment that started with a lot of her work being reissued last year, including her 2 collections of kind of parenting, motherhood around the house, raising demons, and Among the Savages.
I've heard those are very charming,
They're
too.
so good. Really funny.
Yeah, and Lethem's introduction was written, I think, in 2006, and even then, 10 years ago, he was saying, I have this party trick where when people ask me my favorite writer, I say Shirley Jackson and see if they know her. And he said, and increasingly, it's not much of a party trick because everyone does.
Right. It's no longer a very effective litmus test.
And now this fall, we have a very big biography coming of her by the literary critic Ruth Franklin.
Yes.
So that will only continue the Shirley Jackson renaissance.
I'm going to come clean and say I haven't read The Lottery.
You haven't read The Lottery?
Yeah.
So Pamela, what have you been reading?
As I mentioned earlier, I'm also reading Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, which totally draws you in. And my ongoing project, my home book, is Hamilton. I have found that I have a paperback, and if I take that paperback out into the wild, it comes home, a little bit too marred for long-term reading. So it's my home book.
This is the Ron Chernow biography, not the book of Hamilton, the book about the musical.
No, it is not Hamilton. It's the Ron Chernow. And one of the interesting things is I'm listening in the car also to A. Scott Berg's biography of Woodrow Wilson, and there was this sort of brief moment of kind of synchronicity between the 2 books because Hamilton tried to go to Princeton, of course, at that time, and they were not open to letting him in under the terms that he wanted to attend. At that time, people were going to Princeton at like the age of 14 or 15, and if you were super smart, you were going at practically age 12. And the consensus is that he was about 18 at the time, and so he wanted to go on this expedited track. And those who've seen the musical or listened to the music know that this is part of the song with Aaron Burr that he, asks Aaron Burr how he did it. But basically, he was told no at Princeton, and so he moved up north to King's College, which, of course, is now Columbia. And then simultaneously in the A. Scott Berg, there's also this kind of Princeton, not surprisingly, there's often Princeton in A. Scott Berg's books, period in Woodrow Wilson's life where he goes to Princeton. And you kind of realize at that moment, like, Princeton was still so small, so early in its development, so different from, the kind of mega Ivy League university that it's become today, that even though there's about 100 years between those 2 episodes, you feel like you're still kind of talking about that same nascent institution in both books.
That's really interesting.
There's a great anecdote in the Chernow book, I believe, about Hamilton, by legend, sort of got his revenge on Princeton, and during the battle, I don't know if it's the Battle of New Jersey or the Battle of Princeton, I don't know what it was called, he, fired a cannon shot that soared into the window of Nassau Hall, and decapitated a portrait of George II, George III's father.
So listeners, if you're angry that you or your child did not get into Princeton, you can just follow Hamilton's lead.
Exactly.
All right. Jenny, John, thank you so much.
Thanks,
Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.